Hey guys, welcome to the last lecture of the class. This week we will be covering photosynthesis and then different types of vascular, seedless, and then seeded plants. So we will be covering chapter 6 and then chapter 18, section 2. So all of the plants, algae, and bacteria that perform photosynthesis are known as producers. They produce their own food and enough food for the rest of the animals on Earth, which are known as consumers. Makes sense. Photosynthesis will transform solar energy into chemical energy. Or put another way, photosynthesis uses the sun, carbon dioxide, and water to produce glucose and oxygen that they will then release into the atmosphere for animals to use. Photosynthetic organisms include plants that live on land, like mosses, trees, garden plants like sunflowers. They will include plants that live in the ocean, like algae here, diatoms, and protists, like euglena. And then it will also include cyanobacteria, which can live on both land and water. Photosynthesis will take place in a small organelle called the chloroplast, which is this organelle here. And they contain pigments called chlorophyll that will make it and the plant green. Chloroplasts are located in cells called mesophyll cells. Carbon dioxide will enter into the leaves through small holes called stomata, and then water will enter into the plant through the roots. Water and carbon dioxide make their way into the mesophyll cells and then into the chloroplast. So the chloroplast has 3 different layers. The outer membrane is made up of 2 layers, and then the third inner membrane will make up the thylakoids. In between the double membrane and the thylakoid is a space called the stroma. A thylakoid looks like a disc, and a stack of these discs is called grana. You can kind of think of them as like a stack of pancakes. All of the thylakoids in the grana are connected together, and the space inside this is called the thylakoid space. Within the membrane of the thylakoids are various pigments, like chlorophyll, that will absorb solar energy from the sun to help break apart carbon dioxide and water to reform them into both glucose and oxygen. The photosynthetic reaction will take place inside the stroma. So here we have our double membraned outer layer right here, and then we have our third inner membrane here. You can see that the space in between the double membrane and the thylakoid is going to be called the stroma. And then that inner membrane is going to form our stack of pancakes, also called the grana. And then on the inside of the grana is called the thylakoid space. The thylakoid will contain the green pigment chlorophyll that will absorb that solar energy so that it can be used in photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is going to take place inside the stroma, in between that inner membrane and that outer double membrane. Cellular respiration happens within animal cells, as we discussed last week. We use the glucose we eat to give us energy, and then the waste products of this is water and carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis is going to be the complete opposite reaction, so it should be pretty easy to remember. Plants have to use the carbon dioxide we breathe out and convert it into glucose. The plants use the solar energy to break bonds of water. In the same way, cellular respiration must use energy in the form of ATP to break apart the glucose before it enters into glycolysis. Photosynthesis is also known as a redox reaction, just like cellular respiration. As a reminder, anytime a molecule is reduced, electrons and hydrogen ions are going to be given to it. And anytime a molecule is oxidized, electrons and hydrogen ions are going to be taken away from it. With photosynthesis, when 6 waters are oxidized into 6 oxygen molecules and 6 carbon dioxide is reduced, then you get 1 glucose molecule. There are two reactions within photosynthesis. First are the light reactions, and then the Kelvin cycle reactions. The light reactions occur in the thylakoids, and the Kelvin cycle occurs within the stroma. Chlorophyll absorbs solar energy and energizes electrons on the water molecule. This extra energy will then break the bonds between the electrons, hydrogen ions, and the oxygen. The electrons will go through the electron transport chain, just like in that final step of cellular respiration, which will then produce ATP and give a coenzyme NADP and a hydrogen ion, turning it into NADPH. So just like in cellular respiration, we're going to have coenzymes, and our coenzymes in photosynthesis is NADP. After this, the NADPH and the ATP goes into the stroma, where it reduces the carbon dioxide into glucose. So here's a brief representation of photosynthesis. We have our thylakoid here with our green chlorophyll pigment that will absorb the solar energy from the sun, which will energize the water molecule, breaking it apart and then releasing oxygen out into the atmosphere. And then it gives those hydrogen ions to our NADP coenzyme, turning it into NADPH. And then our electron transport chain will also give us ATP. That ATP will then enter into the Kelvin cycle, where it will be used to break apart carbon dioxide and then turning it into glucose. This then frees up the coenzyme ADP and NADP and ADP to go back into the light reactions where they can be used again. So this is a constant cycle that is going on inside the chloroplast. So there's a lot more to solar energy than one may think. Solar energy can be described in terms of its wavelength and energy content. Visible light contains a wide variety of wavelengths, including shorter wavelengths, which will contain more energy, than longer wavelengths, which will contain less energy. Out of all the light that the sun gives off, only about 42% of that light will reach Earth's surface. The ozone that surrounds Earth's atmosphere will filter out the shorter wavelengths, which is really good for us since those shorter wavelengths could cause cancer. And then carbon dioxide and water vapor will also help filter out some of those wavelengths. So like I was saying, solar radiation is made up of a variety of wavelengths. The shorter wavelengths are gamma rays, and the longest wavelengths are called radio waves. The different pigments within the thylakoid membrane are able to absorb different wavelengths within visible light. The pigments that are found in the chloroplast are chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoid. And all of these absorb different wavelengths of visible light, and therefore will make the leaves the colors of the wavelengths they do not absorb. So chlorophyll A and B will absorb violet, blue, and red wavelengths the best, so therefore they will reflect green light, which is what makes leaves look green. Chlorophylls will cover up accessory pigments, like those carotenoids, and so those are not going to be visible to the eye until about the fall time, when those chlorophylls will die away. Carotenoids absorb violet, blue, and green lights, and so therefore they're going to reflect yellow, orange, and even a little bit of red colors. This is why a lot of our fall leaves are going to be browns, oranges, yellows, and reds. The chlorophylls and carotenoids absorb light in two pigment complexes that are used during the light reactions. They are named photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Each pigment complex contains electrons that are excited when the solar energy hits them. When the electrons are energized, when the electrons are energized in photosystem 2, they will move through the electron transport chain. And then when the electrons in pigment 1 are excited, they are then given to NADPH. After the light reactions are finished, we will then end up with ATP and NADPH. The two photosystems were named based on the order they were discovered, not the order that you would find them in the light reactions, unfortunately. However, there were only two, so it shouldn't be too hard to remember. Photosystem 2 will accept electrons first, and then photosystem 1 will accept the electrons. The photosystems are made up of pigments, electron acceptors, and a reaction center. And that reaction center will contain a pair of chlorophyll A pigments. All of the solar energy collected from the pigments are going to be concentrated in the reaction center, and then this energy is going to be used to energize those electrons in the photosystem. So here we have our two photosystems, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. So the first thing that will happen in the light reactions is our water molecule will split, releasing hydrogen ions and hydrogen gas. The electron is going to go to photosystem 2 first, and then solar energy will be absorbed into the reaction center, photosystem 2, which will then energize those electrons. The energized electrons will be given to an electron acceptor, which will carry it through the electron transport chain, which, just like in cellular respiration, will produce ATP. So now our electrons are at a low energy state and are now given to photosystem 1, where they can be re-energized again by the solar energy consumed in those pigments. Our energized electron will be given again to an electron acceptor, which will then be combined with hydrogen ions to form our last product, NADPH. NADPH and ATP are now ready to go to the Kelvin cycle, where it can be used to where it can be used to turn carbon dioxide into glucose. So here's a more detailed and written down explanation of the light reactions. Again, it will start off with photosystem 2, where those first electrons are going to be energized, sent through the electron transport chain. Now they will be de-energized, given to photosystem 1, be re-energized again, and those electrons will be given to NADPH. And we will get our ATP from the electron transport chain, and now our two products will go off to the Kelvin cycle. The electron transport chain in the thylakoid is just like that in the mitochondria. As the electrons are passed from one protein to another, it causes the hydrogen ions from the water and stroma to be pumped into the thylakoid space. This creates a concentration ion gradient. I'm sure it sounds familiar, which again contains a lot of energy. As the hydrogen ions flow through the ATP synthase into the stroma, ATP is going to be produced. The major difference between the electron transport chain and in cellular respiration and photosynthesis is that two coenzymes are used in cellular respiration, but only one coenzyme is used in photosynthesis. So again, all of the light reactions are occurring within the thylakoid. So the photosystem 2, photosystem 1, the entire electron transport system, and the ATP synthase are going to be located within the thylakoid membrane. And this is really good because this promotes a efficient transfer of electrons. So each time the water is split up, the hydrogen ions are going to be pumped into the thylakoid space, and then and when the electrons flow through the electron transport chain, this is also going to put more hydrogen ions into that thylakoid space, establishing a concentration gradient, which is going to contain a lot of energy, which is great because this will be used to turn ADP into ATP, so that the ATP can be used to turn carbon dioxide into glucose. So here we have our thylakoid membrane, and we have our photosystem 2, our electron transport chain, our photosystem 1, and our ATP synthase, all located within that thylakoid membrane. As water is broken apart, our hydrogen ions are going to be pumped into that thylakoid space as the electrons flow through the electron transport chain. When the electrons are done going through the electron transport chain, they will be given to photosystem 1, where they will be re-energized again and given to NADP, which will combine with a hydrogen ion to form NADPH. Since we have established our concentration gradient, the hydrogen ions will flow back into the stroma through the ATP synthase, which will form ATP. So now we have our two products, ATP and NADPH, that will now enter into the Calvin cycle. So there are three steps to the Calvin cycle: the fixation of carbon dioxide, the reduction of carbon dioxide, and then the regeneration of the product that is needed to start the Calvin cycle all over again. And again, the Calvin cycle is when carbon dioxide is going to be turned into glucose, which is our desired goal in photosynthesis. So the fixation of any element is when that element is taken from the atmosphere and made into a form that both plants and animals can use. The plant fixes carbon by attaching it to RUBP by an enzyme called RUBP carboxylase. This forms a 6-carbon molecule, which is then split into two 3-carbon molecules called 3PG. The NADPH and the ATP from the light reactions are used to reduce 3PG, which is then turned into a G3P molecule, which, if you can remember, is what glucose is turned into in the beginning of glycolysis, a cellular respiration. Two G3P molecules will make up a glucose molecule, which again is our desired product. The plant can use G3P to form many organic molecules it needs for energy, like starch, or for structure, like cellulose in the cell wall. So now that the original RUBP was used in the cycle, in that first go-around of the cycle, the plant will need more RUBP to start the cycle all over again. For each turn of the Calvin cycle, 2 G3P are created. In order to make RUBP, though, you will need 5 G3P. This makes 3 turns of the This will take 3 turns of the Calvin cycle. Using ATP, the 5 G3P are used to make 3 RUBP to be used in the cycle, and which will leave 1 G3P to be created into the various sugars the plant will need. So with every 6 turns of the Calvin cycle, you will end up with 1 glucose molecule. So here we have the entire Calvin cycle. And remember, the Calvin cycle is made up of 3 steps: CO2 fixation, CO2 reduction, and then the regeneration of RUBP. First off, carbon fixation happens when a CO2 molecule combines with RUBP, which is a 5-carbon molecule. So right here, here's our carbon from our CO2. CO2 is combined to RUBP by the enzyme called Rubisco. So now carbon dioxide is in a state where the plant can now use it. The next step is carbon dioxide reduction, and this is when 3PG, which we got from breaking apart our 6-carbon molecule right here into 2 3-carbon molecules. ATP from the light reaction is broken down, and the hydrogen and electrons is given to our 3PG, which then turns it into BPG. And our hydrogen ions are given to our coenzyme ADP, giving us NADPH. And so that then turns BPG into G3P. And so now we have our desired product from the Calvin cycle. However, we still need to regenerate the original RUBP. And in order to do that, we need to do a total of 3 Calvin cycle reactions. This is because we still want our desired product, G3P, which eventually becomes glucose. But since we still need to regenerate the RUBP, the 3 turns of the Calvin cycle will give us both G3P and RUBP. And since 2 G3P molecules make up 1 glucose molecule, we will need to do a total of 6 Calvin cycles in order to get 1 G3P molecule, or sorry, 1 glucose molecule. After 6 turns of the Calvin cycle, we will also have 6 RUBP molecules to start the Calvin cycle all over again. So what is the fate of G3P besides glucose? G3P can be used by plants and algae to make a wide variety of molecules. It can form amino acids, fatty acids, and glycerol. It can form glucose and be stored as starch. So it can use that when the sun is not available or it's too cold to perform photosynthesis, like during the winter. It can also form sucrose for transport through the plant, and then it can also form cellulose for the cell walls, which is again just used to help reinforce plant cells. So the photosynthesis process we just talked about is called C3 photosynthesis, and is used by the majority of plants on Earth. So most of the plants in Indiana is going to use C3 photosynthesis. As a result, these plants are called C3 plants. C3 photosynthesis will be used in areas where there's moderate rainfall and temperature. So again, a wide variety of ecosystems that you can find in the United States, Canada, most of Mexico, a lot of Africa, Europe, and even Northern Asia. But in places where it's a little hotter, like the middle part of Africa, in the desert, maybe the rainforest, we'll use a different kind of photosynthesis. C3 photosynthesis is called so because the first molecule produced after carbon fixation is a molecule containing 3 carbons. So within C3 plants, photosynthesis takes place within the chloroplasts that are inside mesophils. As long as the temperature remains moderate or pretty warm, the stomata of the leaves will be open. And remember, the stomata is where carbon dioxide can enter or can leave the plant and carbon dioxide can enter. The Calvin cycle can easily occur since the stomata are so close to those mesophil cells, allowing easy access for that carbon dioxide. And again, as a result of the stomata being so near the mesophil cells, plants can get rid of oxygen, as a buildup of oxygen can actually be really bad for the plant's health. So if it gets really hot and dry in an environment, C3 plants will close their stomata to help retain water so they don't wilt. However, as you guys can imagine, this can limit the amount of CO2 the plant receives and results in a buildup of oxygen. In these plants, that extra oxygen competes with the carbon dioxide for the RUBP molecule, and so the Calvin cycle can't be completed as much. This results in less glucose being made. So there are 2 different types of photosynthesis that are available to plants so that they can still perform photosynthesis in hot and dry environments. Our first type of photosynthesis is C4 photosynthesis, and this is so named because the first molecule after carbon fixation is made up of 4 carbons. This allows the plant to store up extra carbon in case it has to close its stomata. So that extra carbon can be used as energy storage and can be used to make extra glucose. You guys can think of that extra carbon in the same way we store fat. We will use our fat for energy use later on if we really need it, or that fat storage will be used in between meals to help keep our blood sugar up. C4 plants will use that carbon as a form of energy storage to allow them to make glucose, so that the plant can use it for its energy needs. So the mesophyll cells of C3 plants are arranged in a row near the surface of the leaf and randomly inside of it. The mesophyll cells of the C4 plants are instead arranged in a concentric circle around the bundle sheath cells. Bundle sheath cells are those cells that surround the veins of the leaf. Only the bundle sheath cells in C4 plants have chloroplasts within them. There are no chloroplasts in the bundle sheath cells of the C3 plants. In C3 plants, carbon fixation and the carbon reduction happens within the mesophyll cells. This leaves the plant vulnerable to potentially not getting enough if the stomata closes. In C4 plants, carbon dioxide only happens in the mesophyll cells. And extra carbon is being stored as as 4 carbon molecules. The C4 molecules will then enter into the bundle sheath cells, where they go through the next stage of the Calvin cycle. The carbon in the bundle sheath cells will not experience a buildup of oxygen when the somatas are closed, and it can use that extra carbon to power through the rest of the Calvin cycle to make the energy for the plant, even if the environment is too hot and dry. So in C4 plants, carbon fixation and the rest of carbon dioxide are physically separated from each other. CO2 is fixed inside the mesophyll cells, so right here. So CO2 will be turned into a C4 molecule in our mesophyll cells. That C4 will then enter into the bundle sheath cells, where it will continue to undergo the Calvin cycle. So that C4 molecule will be reduced and eventually become G3P. The oxygen will not compete with the Rubisco enzyme, since the carbon fixation and carbon reduction are separated from each other. And again, this allows the rest of the Calvin cycle to continue as long as C4 molecules continue coming into those bundle sheath cells. The oxygen will build up in the mesophyll cells until the temperature is cold enough to where the stomata is open, releasing the oxygen into the atmosphere. So the main difference between C3 and C4 photosynthesis is that the Calvin cycle takes place in two different cells. You would think that the extra movement of the molecules will require a lot of energy and not be beneficial to the plant. But in a hot and dry environment, more glucose is actually created in the C4 plants than in the C3 plants. Depending on the weather, you can expect to see certain plants thriving over others. For example, in the early spring, C3 plants like Kentucky bluegrass and creeping bent grass predominate in laws in the cooler parts of the United States. However, as summer progresses and gets hotter, C4 plants like crabgrass are likely to take over lawns. So the next type of photosynthesis we'll go over is CAM photosynthesis. And CAM photosynthesis is used by plants like succulent plants. An example of a succulent plant is cactus that you can find in deserts. CAM stands for crassulacean acid metabolism. It gets its name from the first family of plants it was discovered in, which are the flowering succulent plants found in the family Crassulaceae. CAM photosynthesis also splits up the Calvin cycle, but it does so in time rather than in location. As C4 plants conduct carbon dioxide in the mesophyll cells and the rest of the Calvin cycle in the bundle sheath cells, CAM plants conduct carbon fixation at night and the rest of the Calvin cycle during the day when the light reactions are happening. Stomata remain open at night to take in as much carbon dioxide as possible and then close up during the day to avoid the water loss. During carbon fixation, CO2 is attached to a 3-carbon molecule, creating a C4 molecule, just like in C4 photosynthesis. These C4 molecules are stored in the vacuoles in the mesophyll cells until they can be used during the day. The NADPH and ATP from the light reaction can then be used to reduce the stored carbon into glucose. The C4 molecule is advantageous in both C4 and CAM plants because it allows more carbon to be taken in quickly and be more efficient with their energy. So within CAM photosynthesis, the entire Calvin cycle will take place within one cell, just at different times of the day. Carbon fixation will happen at night so that the stomata can remain open, getting as much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere without the risk of losing too much water. During the day, the stomatas will close, and also during the day, the pigments in the chlorophyll will take in a lot of light and so therefore energy from the sun, which that energy will then allow the C4 molecule to be reduced and RUBP to be regenerated during the day. During the nighttime, the process will start all over again. So since we just covered the 3 different types of photosynthesis, I wanted to give you guys an idea of the different types of plants that you can find on Earth and that use those types of photosynthesis. All right, so there are 2 types of plants. There's vascular and non-vascular plants. Just given the name, this should give you an idea of the anatomy of those plants. Vascular plants will have vascular tissue of the plants that we talked about earlier, like the xylem, the phloem, the different veins that you can find within plant leaves. Non-vascular plants, on the other hand, do not have these. So their roots, stems, and leaves will have no xylem or phloem. But of course, they still need to get their water and their nutrients in some way. So these type of plants will use diffusion and osmosis to get their nutrients and water. And because of this, non-vascular plants generally need to stay wet in order to survive. The absence of vascular tissue causes these plants to remain very short. Non-vascular plants are also called bryophytes, which is the most familiar, or which of those are most familiar are liverworts and mosses. Mosses are the most abundant type of bryophytes. Mosses are generally found in temperate forests and damp and shaded areas, so like underneath rocks, on, of course, some rotting wood that might be on the ground, even on some dirt. When mosses are in the desert and there isn't much rain, they tend to go into a survival mode, and this survival mode has them looking shriveled and brown. However, as soon as rain appears, they perk up and turn green again. In bogs where the ground is wet and acidic, dead mosses do not decay. The accumulated moss is instead called peat or bog moss, which is used as a type of fuel for like a fire and for fire to like keep warm or fire to cook. It is also used in gardens to improve the water holding capacity of that soil, so the plants can stay more hydrated and produce more vegetables or fruit. All the other plants are called vascular plants because, again, they contain xylem and phloem inside the roots, stems, and leaves. Just as a reminder, the xylem takes up water and minerals up to the leaves, while the phloem takes down organic molecules like glucose to the rest of the plant. The xylem is reinforced by lignin, which makes them stronger, more waterproof and resistant to parasites and bacteria. A lot of vascular plants will utilize seeds to reproduce, but there are also those that use flagellated sperm and eggs instead of seeds. Lycophytes look like mosses, but these have vascular tissue. Typically, an underground horizontal root called a rhizome sends up an aerial shoot where the rest of the plant develops. Leaves on a lycophyte are simple, meaning that there's just one leaf, and they only contain one vein and are called microphyls. The microphyls are tightly packed on the stem, which is what gives them a mossy look. So here you guys can see the horizontal stem, that rhizome, and then you have these aerial shoots that will shoot up into the atmosphere where they can get the carbon dioxide and energy from the sun that they need. Here you can see the microphyls here. So they're just those tiny leaves that are compacted together that give it that mossy look. So these plants contain one vein going up the aerial stem. The sporangia is a receptacle where asexual spores are formed, which can then grow up into adult plants with no fertilization. The sporangia are located on the strobilae up here at the top of the plants. Yeah, I just said that. Ferns do not need seeds to reproduce. However, they are different from lycophytes in that they have larger leaves called megaphylls. These megaphylls contain more vascular tissue and surface area than the microphylls, and this allows them to perform a lot more photosynthesis. Because of the extra energy being produced, ferns can grow a lot taller than the lycophytes. Some lycophytes can grow so big that they look like coconut trees that you can find in like Florida or California. Ferns have branched leaves, which allows them to have more vascular tissue and larger leaflets, giving them this fern and larger appearance. So most of the plants on Earth will use seeds to reproduce. And the seeds contain the embryo of the plant, which will be protected by a seed coat, and then that embryo will be nourished by stored food that's inside the seed. This is very similar to the makeup of an egg. This is a great advantage for these plants because the seeds can survive in dry and unfavorable environments and then sprout when the conditions are favorable again, so when there's good rainfall and the temperature is moderate. Seeds allow plants to reproduce on land in the same way eggs allow birds and reptiles to produce on land. The bryophytes and ferns both require water for the flagellated sperm to swim through to reach the ovule. Seed plants do not require water to get the pollen to the ovule because of the different pollinators we talked about earlier in the semester, so bees, butterflies, bats. So here we have the general anatomy of a seed. So we have the stored food down here. We have the seed coat protecting our food and our embryo. And then we have the embryo right here. It's just a small part of the actual seed. Whenever conditions become favorable, it is the embryo portion of the seed that will sprout, and then the stored food will provide enough nourishment that will allow the seed to germinate and continue to grow until it can start producing and performing photosynthesis. So seed plants have two types of spores that produce two different kinds of gametophytes, or the gametes of the plants. And the gametes of the plants are the pollen and the ovule. When fertilization occurs and a zygote is formed, the zygote becomes the embryo and the ovule becomes stored food for the embryo. These cells can be either naked, like in pine cones, or covered by a fruit. Gymnosperms do not produce fruit, and angiosperms do produce fruit. So gymnosperms are found on cone scales, so that they are said to be naked. The conifers are a dominant group plant and are found all over the world. And conifers will include pine trees that you can easily find around here. So the name conifer means that these trees have cones that contain the reproductive parts. Conifers include pines, spruces, firs, cedars, hemlocks, redwoods, cypresses, and others. Conifers have both the tallest and the longest living trees in the world. The coastal redwood can grow as tall as 100 meters, which is about 300 feet. A bristlecone pine, also found in California, is at least 4,500 years old, which is just crazy to think about. But there is also evidence of a bristlecone pine that lived up to 4,900 years. So conifers will have both male and female cones. The male cones are much smaller than the female cones, and will release a lot of the male gamete, which is pollen. The female cones are larger, and the cone leaves are separated from each other. The pollen will land in these holes, fertilize the ovule, and then the seeds will form inside the female cones. Angiosperms will produce fruit, and therefore means that they are covered seeds. Angiosperms are the most successful group of plants, with 6 times more species than all the other plant groups combined. They are found all over the world and in many different types of habitats. They are, of course, the most common garden plants, because why else would we grow them if we can't get some type of produce from them? Angiosperm rely on wind and various pollinators to take the pollen to other flowers so it can reproduce. The type of flower that is produced tells you something about the type of pollinator that it attracts. Insect and pollinated flowers are generally large and showy, and so if the pollen is wind dispersed, the flowers are not going to be as glamorous. Night blooming flowers are white and aromatic so that the smell can attract mammals to them. Many flowers attract only certain types of pollinators. For example, bee-pollinated plants are usually blue or yellow and have UV shadings that lead the pollinator to the location of the nectar. And then as the bee is feeding on the nectar, it will pick up pollen. The resulting fruits can be dispersed by wind, gravity, water, or animals. In the same way the petals will attract the pollinators, the fruit will attract different animals to eat the fruit and the seeds. Later on, the seeds will be dispersed wherever that animal will go to the bathroom, and then the excrement, the nutrients that are inside the excrement, will nourish the seed to help it germinate and can continue to provide nourishment as it grows, as the excrement becomes a part of the soil. Different types of fruits that can be grown on plants include bananas, coconuts, grains, including corn, wheat, and rice, and then bean pods and pea pods will also count as fruit. So here's the general anatomy of a flower. So you have our little ovules here, which are our pea pods, our peas inside our pod. Surrounding our peas is our ovary wall. And then attached to our ovary wall is our male and female parts, so the stigma and the anthers. The anthers contain the pollen that will be dispersed by wind or by different pollinators. And the tip of the stigma is going to be sticky so that it can catch any pollen that might come its way. That pollen will then make its way down into the ovary, where it can then fertilize the ovule. So I know you guys have heard of carnivorous plants like the Venus flytrap. So what do you guys think? Do you guys think that they perform photosynthesis, or do you think that they might get all of their nutrients from what they eat? Surprisingly, it's a little bit of both. So carnivorous plants will still produce the glucose that they need from photosynthesis, but they will still get nutrients from the insects and the other animals that they eat. They do not get any energy from these animals or insects, but instead nutrients. Carnivorous plants are generally found in areas where the soil is lacking a certain nutrient, like nitrogen. Nitrogen is an essential nutrient for plants. Plants will get their missing elements from the animals and the insects that they eat. And there are over 600 different kinds of carnivorous plants found throughout the world. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture, and I really enjoyed having you all this semester. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and email me. And if you guys need any help studying for the test, shoot me an email, and I will try my best. Take care. Bye.